Mayday, mayday, this is Rigel of Risia Prime. We need help. Please, if anyone can hear this, we need your aid. The fate of the galaxy is at stake. The desperate plea crackled through the subspace relay, reaching the Terran Alliance Command Center on Earth. Admiral Ivanova replayed the message, her brow furrowed. She turned to her aide. Get me everything we have on Risia Prime, and find Paul Brown. Looks like we've got a situation on our hands. Paul Brown, a weathered ex-soldier with a troubled history, found himself on a shuttle to Risia Prime within the hour. As the blue-green planet grew larger in the viewport, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would be unlike any other. The shuttle touched down amidst the chaos of a once peaceful world, torn apart by civil war. Rigel, the Risian scientist who had sent the distress call, greeted Paul with a mix of relief and urgency. Thank the stars you're here, Rigel said, leading Paul through the rubble-strewn streets. The ruling class has gone mad with power. They're experimenting with a technology that could threaten the entire galaxy if it falls into the wrong hands. Paul listened intently as Rigel explained the stakes. The resistance needed his help to overthrow the corrupt government and secure the dangerous technology before it was too late. But as Paul delved deeper into the conflict, he realized that the situation was far more complex than he had anticipated. Multiple factions vied for control, each with their own hidden agendas. Trust was a rare commodity on Risia Prime. With time running out and the fate of countless worlds hanging in the balance, Paul knew he had to act fast. He joined forces with the outgunned resistance fighters, determined to stop the ruling class before they could unleash their devastating weapon upon an unsuspecting galaxy. The battle for Risia Prime had begun, and failure was not an option. Under the cover of darkness, Paul and Rigel slipped into the heavily fortified research facility. They moved with practiced stealth, avoiding patrols and security cameras as they made their way deeper into the complex. Their objective was clear: gather intel on the ruling class's secret weapon and get out undetected. Well, what do we have here? Zaphod sneered, his cold eyes locked on Paul. A human and a traitor caught red-handed. Paul didn't hesitate. He dove for cover, pulling Rigel with him as a hail of laser fire erupted around them. The ex-soldier returned fire, his aim steady and true. Rigel, though not a fighter, managed to hold his own, providing crucial covering fire as they fought their way towards the exit. The firefight was fierce, but Paul's superior combat skills and quick thinking gave them the edge they needed. He led Zaphod and his men on a deadly game of cat and mouse through the facility's winding corridors, using every trick in his arsenal to stay one step ahead. Just as they reached the exit, a stray shot caught Rigel in the shoulder. He stumbled, crying out in pain. Paul dragged him to safety, but the damage was done. They needed help, and fast. Paul tapped into his network of rebel sympathizers, seeking a safe haven where they could lay low and tend to Rigel's wound. It was a risk, but one he had to take. Among the rebels was Lyra, a skilled hacker with a talent for cracking even the most secure systems. As Rigel recovered, Lyra set to work on the data they'd managed to steal from the research facility. What she found sent a chill down Paul's spine. The ruling class was developing a mind control device, one capable of enslaving entire populations, and they planned to use it to crush the rebellion and expand their control beyond Risia Prime. Time was running out. Paul and Rigel knew they had to act fast. They devised a plan to sabotage the weapon's production and expose the government's crimes to the Risian people. But they couldn't do it alone. They turned to Captain Argo, a charismatic rebel leader with a loyal following. Argo listened to their plan, his eyes gleaming with determination. He pledged his support, gathering a strike team of his best fighters for a daring raid on the main manufacturing facility. The mission was risky, but if they succeeded, it could turn the tide of the war. Paul and Rigel led the charge, their skills honed by years of combat. The rebels fought with bravery and determination, facing down the facility's defenses and the government forces that rushed to stop them. In the end, they managed to destroy the production line and steal the evidence they needed to expose the ruling class's crimes. But the victory came at a heavy cost. Many of the rebels fell in battle, sacrificing their lives to ensure that Paul and Rigel could escape with the truth. Their hearts pounding, Paul and Rigel burst into the rebel base, clutching the stolen evidence that could finally turn the tide against the corrupt government. But their triumphant return was short-lived. The base was in chaos, under heavy fire from government forces. Commander Zaphod's troops had broken through the defenses, their superior firepower and numbers quickly overwhelming the rebel fighters. Paul's eyes narrowed as he assessed the dire situation. The rebels were outmatched and outgunned. They needed help, and fast. He sprinted to the communications room, dodging laser blasts and debris. With Rigel covering the door, Paul sent an urgent message to the Terran Alliance, pleading for reinforcements. "This is Paul Brown requesting immediate assistance on Rizia Prime. The rebel cause is on the brink of collapse. We need your help." But the response was not what he had hoped for. The Terran Alliance, hesitant to get involved in what they saw as an internal conflict, offered only vague promises of support. Paul slammed his fist against the console in frustration. They were on their own. Thinking quickly, Paul devised a risky plan. If they couldn't match Zaphod's forces in a straight fight, they would have to even the odds another way. He gathered a small team of the most skilled rebels and briefed them on their mission: to infiltrate the capital city and capture a high-ranking government official, someone they could use as leverage against Zaphod. The team moved swiftly and silently through the war-torn streets, avoiding patrols and checkpoints. They managed to locate and abduct their target, a senior minister with close ties to the ruling class. But as they made their escape, all hell broke loose. Zaphod and his elite guard were hot on their heels, determined to retrieve the minister at any cost. Laser fire filled the air as Paul's team weaved through the city streets in a desperate bid to shake off their pursuers. Paul's expert piloting skills were put to the test as he navigated the narrow alleys and crowded thoroughfares, narrowly evading capture at every turn. Finally, after a heart-pounding chase that left a trail of destruction in its wake, they managed to break free of the city limits and race towards a remote safe house, the minister securely in their custody. But even as they caught their breath, Paul knew that their mission was far from over. In the dimly lit safe house, Paul and his team interrogated the minister, pressing him for information on the mind control device that threatened to seal the government's grip on power. The official, his defiance crumbling under the weight of Paul's relentless questioning, finally revealed the terrible truth. The device was nearly complete and would be deployed within a matter of days. Back at the rebel base, Rigel and the others fought on, holding out against the government's onslaught with grim determination. But supplies were running low, and morale was beginning to fray. They couldn't hold out much longer. With the clock ticking and the rebel cause hanging by a thread, Paul gathered his team for one final desperate mission. Failure meant the end of freedom in the galaxy. Success would require skill, courage, and no small amount of luck. The strike team moved through the shadows, bypassing security checkpoints with the captured officials' access codes. Rigel's fingers danced across the keypad, his breath caught in his throat as the heavy blast doors slid open with a hiss. Inside, the sterile corridors of the government headquarters stretched out before them, all gleaming metal and harsh light. Paul signaled for the team to split up, each taking a different route to the central chamber, where the mind control device lay waiting. But their covert entry had not gone unnoticed. Commander Zaphod's voice boomed over the intercom. "Did you really think it would be that easy, human?" Zaphod's elite guards swarmed the corridors, their cybernetic enhancements glinting in the artificial light. Laser fire erupted from all sides as Paul and his team fought their way forward, ducking behind support columns and returning fire with grim determination. Argo's team encountered a squad of genetically enhanced super soldiers, their muscles rippling beneath form-fitting armor. The rebels, outmatched in raw strength, relied on speed and cunning to outmaneuver their opponents. They danced around the super soldiers, peppering them with laser blasts until the hulking figures crashed to the ground, smoking and still. Paul and Rigel pushed ahead, dodging automated sentry guns that sprang from the walls. Rigel's quick thinking and Paul's lightning reflexes kept them one step ahead of the deadly beams. They reached the central chamber, battered but unbroken, only to find themselves face to face with Zaphod himself. The Rizian commander stood before the mind control device, a sneer twisting his features. "You're too late, human. The device is ready. Soon every living being in the galaxy will bow to our will." He lunged at the commander, and the two titans clashed in a whirlwind of punches and kicks. Zaphod's cybernetic arm lashed out, catching Paul in the ribs with a sickening crunch. But the ex-soldier fought through the pain, his own blows fueled by a lifetime of training and an unwavering resolve. As they grappled, Rigel and the others raced to the mind control device, planting explosives at its base. The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity, as Paul and Zaphod traded blows, neither giving an inch. A sharp crack echoed through the chamber as Paul's fist connected with Zaphod's jaw, sending the commander staggering back. In that moment, Rigel's voice cut through the chaos. "It's done. We need to go. Now." Paul disengaged from Zaphod, his chest heaving as he backed towards the exit. The Rizian commander, his face twisted with rage, reached for his fallen blaster, but it was too late. The explosives detonated, the shockwave hurling Paul and his team out of the chamber as the mind control device erupted in a blinding flash of light and heat. Alarms blared, and the floor shook beneath their feet as they raced through the crumbling corridors, dodging falling debris and the last desperate shots of Zaphod's guard. They burst out into the open air, the government headquarters collapsing behind them in a roar of flame and twisted metal. Paul and Zaphod crashed through the chamber, locked in a vicious hand-to-hand duel. Blood streamed down Paul's face from a gash above his eye, but he fought on, blocking Zaphod's cybernetic strikes and retaliating with brutal jabs of his own. The Rizian commander's face contorted with rage and pain as Paul's fist slammed into his flesh. As the titanic struggle unfolded, Rigel and the team raced against time to plant the explosives. Sweat poured down their faces, their hands shaking as they primed the charges. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. A sickening crack echoed through the chamber as Paul's fist connected with Zaphod's jaw, sending the commander staggering back. Paul pressed his advantage, raining blows down upon his adversary with relentless fury. Zaphod reeled under the onslaught, his cybernetic enhancement sparking and sputtering. With a final devastating uppercut, Paul sent Zaphod crashing to the floor unconscious. But the victory came at a heavy price. Paul slumped to his knees, his body battered and broken. Blood poured from a dozen wounds, and his vision swam. "Now, blow it now!" Rigel shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. The explosives detonated with a deafening roar, the shockwave hurling Paul and the team across the chamber. The mind control device erupted in a blinding flash of light and heat, the explosion tearing through the building like a vengeful god. Outside, the rebel forces watched in awe as the government headquarters shuddered and collapsed, flames leaping into the night sky. Seizing the moment, they surged forward, pouring into the breach with weapons blazing. The loyalist forces, caught off guard and demoralized, fell back in disarray. Captain Argo burst into the ruined chamber, his eyes widening as he took in the scene of devastation. He spotted Paul lying motionless among the rubble and raced to his side, hefting the wounded soldier onto his shoulders. "We've got you, Paul," Argo said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it. You saved us all." As the rebels fought their way through the crumbling halls of the government headquarters, Argo carried Paul to safety, dodging falling debris and enemy fire. The wounded soldier drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind reeling from the pain and exhaustion. Back at the rebel base, Lyra pored over the data streaming in from the front lines, her brow furrowed with concentration. Suddenly her eyes widened in horror. "No, no, no," she whispered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "This can't be happening." She opened a comm channel to Paul, her voice trembling with urgency. "Paul, can you hear me? We have a problem, a big one." Paul, barely conscious, struggled to focus on Lyra's words. "What is it?" he croaked, his voice raw and hoarse. "The ruling class, they have a backup plan," Lyra said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Another mind control device hidden somewhere off-world. They're going to use it to crush the rebellion, to enslave everyone in the galaxy. Paul's heart sank, despair washing over him like a cold tide. After everything they'd been through, all the sacrifices they'd made, it still wasn't enough. But then a flicker of determination ignited in his chest. He couldn't give up, not now, not when they were so close. He struggled to sit up, ignoring the searing pain that shot through his battered body. "We have to stop them," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "We have to find that device and destroy it, no matter what it takes." Rigel and Argo exchanged worried glances, but they knew better than to argue with Paul when he had that look in his eyes. They helped him to his feet, steadying him as he swayed. "I'm with you," Rigel said, clasping Paul's shoulder. "Until the end." Argo nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'll gather my best fighters. We'll follow you into hell itself if that's what it takes." Paul took a deep breath, steeling himself for the battle ahead. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that they would face dangers beyond anything they'd encountered before. But he also knew that they had no choice. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and they were the only ones who could tip the scales. As the small band of rebels set out into the wilderness, following the faint trail of clues that Lyra had uncovered, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would be their greatest challenge yet. The terrain was treacherous, the wildlife deadly, and the loyalist forces that still clung to power were sure to dog their every step. But he also knew that they had something the enemy could never understand: the unbreakable bonds of friendship, the unquenchable thirst for freedom, and the indomitable will of the human spirit. And with those weapons at their side, Paul knew that they would prevail, no matter the odds. The small team trekked through dense jungles, their progress slowed by Paul's injuries and the need for stealth. Rigel took point, his keen senses alert for any sign of danger. Argo and his fighters fanned out around them, their weapons at the ready. Suddenly, a burst of laser fire erupted from the undergrowth, narrowly missing Paul's head. The rebels dove for cover, returning fire as a squad of loyalist soldiers emerged from the foliage, their faces twisted with hatred. Paul gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain that lanced through his body as he crawled behind a fallen log. He snapped off a series of shots, taking down 2 of the attackers before they could find cover. Beside him, Rigel lobbed a grenade into the midst of the loyalists, the explosion sending bodies flying. Argo and his fighters charged forward, engaging the enemy hand to hand with a ferocity that belied their weariness. The skirmish was brief but bloody, the rebels emerging victorious but not unscathed. One of Argo's men lay dead, his sightless eyes staring up at the jungle canopy. 2 others were wounded, their blood staining the leaf litter crimson. Paul struggled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew they couldn't afford to rest, couldn't afford to mourn the fallen. Every moment they delayed brought the ruling class one step closer to activating the second mind control device. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We're running out of time." Rigel nodded, his face grim. "The loyalists know we're coming now. They'll be waiting for us." "Let them wait," Argo growled, hefting his weapon. "We'll give them a fight they won't soon forget." As the rebels pressed on, the jungle seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening with each passing hour. Paul could feel the weight of the galaxy's fate pressing down upon him, the burden of responsibility almost too much to bear. But he pushed on, driven by a fierce determination to see this through to the end. He thought of all the lives that hung in the balance, all the innocent souls who would suffer if the ruling class succeeded in their mad scheme. He thought of Admiral Ivanova, waiting anxiously back on Earth for word of their success. He thought of the brave rebels who had given their lives to bring them this far, their sacrifices a testament to the unbreakable spirit of resistance. And most of all he thought of Zaphod, the once proud commander brought low by his own hubris and cruelty. Paul had beaten him once, and he would beat him again, no matter the cost. The jungle thinned out, giving way to a barren landscape of jagged rocks and deep crevasses. The rebels picked their way forward, every sense alert for any sign of danger. Up ahead, a dark shape loomed against the horizon, a massive structure that seemed to grow larger with each passing step. Paul's heart raced as he realized what it was: the secret facility housing the backup mind control device. "There it is," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's our target." Rigel swallowed hard, his face pale in the fading light. "It's heavily guarded. We'll never get inside undetected." Paul's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing with fierce determination. "We have to try. We've come too far to turn back now." As the rebels closed in on the facility, Paul knew that the final battle was about to begin. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and he would stop at nothing to see this mission through to the end, even if it meant laying down his own life in the process. The barren landscape seemed to stretch on forever, the jagged rocks casting long shadows in the fading light. Paul's heart pounded in his chest as he led his team towards the secret facility, every nerve in his body screaming with tension. Suddenly a piercing shriek rent the air, and a blur of movement exploded from behind a nearby boulder. Paul barely had time to react before a massive, snarling creature slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. The genetically engineered monstrosity loomed over him, its razor-sharp claws slashing at his face. Paul rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the deadly talons, and came up firing his blaster. The creature howled in pain as the energy bolt seared its flesh, but it kept coming, its wounds healing almost as quickly as they were inflicted. All around him, Paul's team fought for their lives against a horde of the vicious beasts. Argo's fighters unleashed a hail of laser fire, the air crackling with the stench of ozone and burnt flesh. But the creatures were relentless, their enhanced speed and strength making them almost impossible to bring down. With a roar of fury, Paul charged towards her, his heart pounding in his ears. He leapt onto the creature's back, his fingers scrabbling for a grip on its slick, armored hide. The beast thrashed and bucked, trying to throw him off, but Paul held on with grim determination. He drew his knife and plunged it into the creature's neck, again and again, until hot blood spurted from the wounds. The beast let out a gurgling cry and collapsed, its body twitching in its death throes. Paul nodded, too winded to speak. He looked around, taking stock of the situation. The battle was over, the last of the creatures lying dead at their feet. But the cost had been high. Several of Argo's fighters lay unmoving, their bodies torn and bloody. Rigel knelt beside one of the fallen creatures, her brow furrowed with concentration. She pulled a small device from its shattered skull, turning it over in her hands. "Look at this," she said, holding it up for Paul to see. "It's some kind of neural implant. I think it was controlling the creature's actions." Paul's eyes widened with realization. "The ruling class," he growled. "They must have created these things to hunt us down." Paul felt a surge of hope, mixed with a sense of dread. They were so close to their goal, but he knew that the ruling class would stop at nothing to protect their secret weapon. With renewed determination, he gathered his team and set off towards the coordinates, his mind racing with thoughts of the challenges that lay ahead. They trekked through the hostile terrain, their weapons at the ready, alert for any sign of danger. As they approached the location, Paul's heart sank. The facility was a massive, fortified structure, its walls bristling with gun turrets and patrolled by heavily armed guards. There was no way they could sneak in undetected. But then a figure emerged from the shadows, and Paul felt his blood run cold. It was his former commanding officer, a man he had once looked up to as a mentor and a friend. But now he wore the uniform of the ruling class, his face twisted with a sneer of contempt. "Well, well, look who it is," the man said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The great Paul Brown, savior of the galaxy. I always knew you were too soft for this job." Paul felt a surge of anger, mixed with a sense of betrayal. He had trusted this man, followed his orders without question, and now he was working for the enemy, helping them to enslave the galaxy. "Why?" Paul demanded, his voice shaking with emotion. "Why would you turn your back on everything we fought for?" Paul shook his head, his heart heavy with sorrow. "I can't let you do this," he said, raising his blaster. "I won't let you enslave the galaxy." The man smirked, his hand hovering over his own weapon. "You don't have a choice. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now and I might just let you live. But Paul knew that surrender was not an option. He had come too far, sacrificed too much to give up now. With a final, defiant cry, he charged forward, his team at his side, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and he would not let it fall. Paul's heart raced as he stared down the barrel of Colonel Rook's blaster. The man he once trusted with his life now stood before him, a traitor to the cause they had both sworn to defend. Rook's eyes glinted with a cold, calculating light, his face a mask of smug superiority. "You're on the wrong side of history, Paul," Rook said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The ruling class has already won. The mind control device is the future, the only way to bring order to the chaos of the galaxy." Paul's grip tightened on his own weapon, his jaw clenched with fury. "I'll never join you," he spat. "I'd rather die than betray the rebels, than betray everything I believe in." Rook shook his head, a mocking smile playing across his lips. "Always the idealist, aren't you? You never could see the bigger picture." With a sudden motion, Rook fired his blaster. Paul dove to the side, the searing bolt of energy missing him by inches. He rolled to his feet and returned fire, the air crackling with the stench of ozone and burnt flesh. All around them, the battle raged. Paul's team clashed with Rook's elite soldiers, the sound of blaster fire and the screams of the wounded and dying filling the air. Paul caught glimpses of his comrades fighting with grim determination. Argo, his face a mask of rage as he cut down enemy after enemy. Lyra, her fingers flying over the controls of a stolen hover tank as she provided covering fire. But for every loyalist soldier they felled, two more seemed to take their place. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and Paul knew that time was running out. He lunged at Rook, his fists flying in a flurry of blows. The two men grappled, their bodies slamming against the walls of the facility as they fought with brutal, desperate strength. Rook's cybernetic arm lashed out, catching Paul in the ribs with a sickening crunch. But Paul fought through the pain, his own blows fueled by a lifetime of training and an unquenchable thirst for justice. In the heart of the facility, Rigel and her team raced through the corridors, their weapons at the ready. They burst into the control room, only to find themselves face to face with a team of scientists, their faces pale with fear. "Please," one of the scientists begged, his hands trembling. "Don't hurt us, we were only following orders." Rigel's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on her blaster. "The mind control device," she demanded. "Where is it?" The scientist swallowed hard, his gaze darting to a massive screen on the far wall. "It's already active," he whispered, "connected to a network of satellites. It's broadcasting its signal across the entire galaxy." Rigel's heart sank, a cold dread settling in the pit of her stomach. The stakes had never been higher. If they couldn't disable the device and its satellite network, the ruling class would be able to enslave entire worlds with a single thought. They set to work, their fingers flying over the controls as they raced against time. Outside, the battle raged on, the fate of the galaxy hanging in the balance. Paul and Rook fought with renewed ferocity, their bodies battered and bleeding, their wills unbreakable. The air grew thick with smoke. Warning klaxons blared, the floor shook. But still they fought. Two men, each convinced of the righteousness of their cause, locked in a battle to the death as the fate of billions hung in the balance. In the control room, the seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. Rigel's team worked frantically, their brows slick with sweat as they struggled to shut down the device. The scientists huddled in the corner, their faces twisted with fear. A sudden explosion rocked the facility, sending debris flying. One of the rebels cried out, clutching a wound in his side, but still they pressed on, driven by desperation and an unshakable belief in the cause of freedom. And then, with a final triumphant shout, they did it. The mind control device powered down, its signal fading into silence. The satellites went dark, their threat neutralized at last. In the heart of the facility, Paul and Rook staggered back from each other, their chests heaving with exertion. Rook's face twisted with rage, his eyes burning with hatred. "You think you've won? he snarled, his voice raw with fury. "You think this is over? The ruling class will never stop, never rest until every last rebel is crushed beneath our boot." Paul shook his head, a weary smile playing across his bloodied lips. "You're wrong," he said. "The people will never stop fighting for their freedom, and as long as there are those willing to stand up against tyranny, there will always be hope." With a final defiant roar, Rook lunged at Paul, his blaster raised for the kill shot. But Paul was faster. He fired, the bolt of energy catching Rook square in the chest. The traitor crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Paul stood over him, his heart heavy with sorrow and regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry it had to end this way." But there was no time for grief, no time for mourning. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Paul turned to his team, his eyes blazing with renewed determination. The scientists' fingers flew over the control panel, their faces contorted with desperation. "Activate the self-destruct sequence," the lead scientist barked. "We can't let them dismantle the device." The rebels hesitated, torn between their loyalty to Rigel and the urgency of the situation. "We can't leave you," one of them cried. Rigel's voice was steel. "That's an order. Go now." With anguished looks, the rebels turned and fled, racing through the crumbling corridors as the countdown began. Outside, Paul and Rook clashed in a whirlwind of punches and kicks, their bodies battered and bloody. Rook's cybernetic enhancements gave him an edge, his blows landing with crushing force. Paul staggered back, his vision swimming. Just as Rook moved in for the kill, Paul's comlink crackled to life. "Paul!" Rigel's voice was strained, barely audible over the chaos. "The scientists activated a self-destruct sequence. I'm staying behind to dismantle the device. You have to get out now." Paul's heart stopped. He knew what Rigel was sacrificing. In that moment, his fight with Rook seemed meaningless. He had to reach her, had to stop her from throwing her life away. With a roar of fury, Paul launched himself at Rook, catching the traitor off guard. His fist slammed into Rook's jaw, sending him reeling. Paul didn't wait for him to recover. He turned and sprinted towards the facility, his heart pounding in his ears. The ground shook beneath his feet as explosions ripped through the complex. Debris rained down around him, the heat of the flames searing his skin. But Paul didn't falter. He leapt over fallen beams and ducked under collapsing archways, his every thought focused on reaching Rigel. Inside the device chamber, Rigel worked with single-minded focus, her hands a blur as she tore at the mind-control device's innards. Wires sparked, and components clattered to the floor as she stripped away layer after layer of circuitry. The countdown ticked down with merciless speed. Rigel's breath came in ragged gasps, her muscles screaming with fatigue. She was so close, the final component almost within reach. A massive blast shook the chamber, the force of the shockwave hurling Rigel across the room like a rag doll. She slammed into the far wall and crumpled to the floor, buried beneath an avalanche of rubble and twisted metal. Seconds later, Paul burst into the room, his eyes wild with panic. "Rigel!" he screamed, his voice raw with desperation. But there was no answer, only the roar of the flames and the ominous groaning of the failing structure. Frantically, Paul began to dig through the debris, his hands torn and bleeding as he heaved aside jagged chunks of concrete and steel. He had to find her, had to save her. He refused to accept the alternative. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, but in that moment, all that mattered was the life of one brave Rizian woman and the human soldier determined to bring her back from the brink of oblivion. Paul heaved chunks of concrete and twisted steel aside, his hands raw and bleeding. "Rigel!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Rigel, where are you?" The ground shook beneath his feet as another explosion rocked the crumbling facility. Flames licked at the debris, the heat searing his skin. But Paul didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not until he found her. And then a miracle. A weak cough, a stirring beneath the rubble. Paul lunged forward, tearing at the debris with renewed frenzy. His fingers closed around a slender arm, and he pulled with all his might. Rigel emerged from the wreckage, her face streaked with blood and dust. She blinked up at him, her eyes unfocused. "Paul," she whispered. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. The facility was coming down around them, the walls cracking and the ceiling caving in. They had to get out, and fast. He could hear the sounds of battle raging outside, the crack of blaster fire and the shouts of the rebels. But he couldn't focus on that now. All that mattered was getting Rigel to safety. The exit was just ahead, a jagged hole in the wall where the blast had torn through. Paul stumbled towards it, his lungs burning and his muscles screaming with fatigue. And then, with a final deafening roar, the facility imploded behind them. The shockwave knocked Paul off his feet, sending him tumbling to the ground with Rigel clutched tight against his chest. For a moment he lay there, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. But then he heard the shouts of the rebels, saw them rushing towards him with medical kits and stretchers. He struggled to his feet, still cradling Rigel in his arms. She was limp and unresponsive, her breathing shallow and her pulse weak. The rebels swarmed around them, their faces grim with concern. They took Rigel from Paul's arms, laying her gently on a stretcher and rushing her towards the waiting medical transport. "We've got Rook," Argo said, his voice tight. "The bastard tried to run, but we caught him, and he's been singing like a bird." Paul's heart clenched, a wave of nausea rising in his throat. What did he say? Argo's jaw tightened. He was working with the ruling class all along. He orchestrated the whole damn war, playing both sides against each other, all for his own power and glory. Paul staggered back, his mind reeling with the revelation. Rook, his mentor, his friend, the man he had trusted with his life, a traitor, a manipulator, a monster. He felt a surge of rage, a burning desire to confront Rook, to make him pay for his crimes. But then he looked back at Rigel, her broken body being loaded into the medical transport, and the anger drained away, replaced by a hollow ache in his chest. Paul turned away, his shoulders slumped with the weight of it all. He knew that the fight was far from over, that there would be more battles to come, more losses to endure. But for now, all he could do was hope. Hope that Rigel would recover, that the Rizian people would find the strength to rebuild, that the galaxy would one day know true peace. He climbed aboard the waiting shuttle, his heart heavy and his mind numb. As the craft lifted off, he looked back at the war-torn landscape of HFY Prime, a grim reminder of the price of freedom. The journey back to Earth was a blur, a haze of medical reports and debriefings. Paul barely slept, his mind haunted by the faces of the fallen, the sound of Rigel's anguished screams. But then a glimmer of hope. News from the medical bay, a message from the doctors. Rigel was stable, her injuries severe but not life-threatening. She would recover given time and care. Paul felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a flicker of light in the darkness. He made his way to the medical bay, his heart pounding with anticipation. Rigel lay on the bed, her face pale and drawn, her body wrapped in bandages. But when she saw Paul, a weak smile crossed her lips, a spark of life in her eyes. "Hey," she whispered, her voice hoarse. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of all they had endured hanging heavy in the air between them. But then Rigel spoke, her words soft but fierce. "We did it," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We won." Paul nodded, his throat tight. "We did," he said. "But the cost—" Rigel squeezed his hand, her grip weak but insistent. "I know," she said, "but it was worth it. It has to be worth it." He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a promise and a prayer. "Rest now," he said. "You've earned it." As he left the medical bay, Paul's mind was already racing ahead, planning for the future. The Terran Alliance had pledged their support to the new Rizian government, but he knew that the road ahead would be long and hard. There would be challenges to face, enemies to confront, sacrifices to make, but he also knew that the Rizian people had the strength and determination to forge their own path, to build a better future for themselves and for the galaxy. As his ship departed, Paul looked back at the war-torn planet, a grim reminder of the battles yet to come. But he also saw hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness, a promise of a brighter tomorrow. The fight for freedom was far from over. But with Rigel by his side and the courage of the Rizian people in his heart, Paul knew that they would prevail, no matter the cost, no matter the odds. A trio of armed guards escorted him to the debriefing room, their faces impassive behind dark visors. Paul's mind raced as he strode through the sterile corridors, preparing himself for the confrontation to come. The door slid open, revealing a room dominated by a large circular table. The Terran Alliance leadership sat around it, their expressions ranging from guarded to openly hostile. Admiral Ivanova rose to greet him, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Captain Brown," she said, her voice cold, "we've been expecting you." Ivanova's eyes narrowed. "I'm sure you do, but first there's something you need to know." She tapped a control on the table, and a holographic display sprang to life in the center of the room. Paul's eyes widened as he saw schematics for the mind control device, alongside images of human scientists working in secret labs. "The technology was ours from the beginning," Ivanova said, her voice flat. "We developed it and we supplied the Rizian ruling class with the resources and knowledge they needed to build it." Paul's blood ran cold. "You used them," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You used the Rizians as guinea pigs, and you were willing to let them suffer and die for your own gain." One of the other leaders, a silver-haired man in a crisp uniform, spoke up. "It was a necessary sacrifice," he said, his tone dismissive. "The mind control technology is a game-changer. With it, we can maintain peace and stability throughout the galaxy." Paul slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Peace through subjugation is not peace at all," he snarled. "You're no better than the Rizian tyrants I fought against." Ivanova's face hardened. "Watch your tone, Captain," she warned. "You're speaking to your superiors." But Paul was beyond caring about rank or protocol. "To hell with your orders," he spat. "I won't be a part of this. I won't let you spread this technology to other worlds, to enslave more innocent people." The leaders exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of annoyance and contempt. "You don't have a choice," the silver-haired man said. "You're a soldier of the Terran Alliance. You'll do as you're told." He turned on his heel and strode from the room, ignoring the shouts of the guards and the angry exclamations of the leaders. His mind was made up. He would steal a ship and set out to warn the other races of the galaxy, to forge an alliance against the Terran Alliance's machinations. As he raced through the corridors, alarms began to blare, the sound of booted feet echoing behind him. Paul's heart pounded in his chest as he reached the hangar bay, his eyes scanning the rows of ships for one that could carry him to freedom. There, a sleek black vessel with the lines of a courier ship, fast and maneuverable, with a hyperdrive that could cross the galaxy in days. Paul sprinted towards it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He leapt into the cockpit, his hands flying over the controls as he powered up the engines. The ship lifted off, the hangar doors sliding open to reveal the star-studded blackness of space. Paul gunned the engines, the force of acceleration slamming him back into his seat. He watched the Terran Alliance headquarters recede behind him, the weight of his betrayal and the magnitude of his mission settling on his shoulders. He was a renegade now, a fugitive from the very organization he had sworn to serve, but he knew in his heart that he was doing the right thing. The galaxy deserved to know the truth, and he would risk everything to make sure that it did. As the ship hurtled through the void, Paul's mind raced with plans and possibilities. He would need allies, resources, a way to stay one step ahead of his pursuers. But for now, all that mattered was the open expanse of space before him, and the knowledge that he was finally free to fight for what he believed in. Paul set course for the nearest alien world, a planet he knew from the Terran Alliance's intelligence reports. They were a proud people, with a long history of resistance against outside interference. If anyone would be willing to listen to his warnings, it would be them. The journey was long and perilous, with the constant threat of pursuit from Terran Alliance forces. Paul pushed the ship to its limits, skimming the edges of black holes and diving through asteroid fields to evade detection. When he finally reached the alien world, he was exhausted and on edge, his nerves frayed from the constant stress of the chase. But he knew he couldn't rest, not yet. He landed the ship on the outskirts of a sprawling city, the spires of alien architecture rising into the purple sky. As he stepped onto the soil of a new world, he felt a thrill of excitement mingled with trepidation. The aliens were wary at first, suspicious of this human who had come to them with wild tales of betrayal and conspiracy. But Paul was persistent, his passion and sincerity winning them over. He showed them the evidence he had gathered, the schematics and recordings that proved the Terran Alliance's treachery, and slowly, tentatively, they began to believe. They pledged their support, offering Paul sanctuary and resources as he continued his mission. And with each new ally he gained, each new world he visited, Paul felt his resolve grow stronger. But he knew that the Terran Alliance would not let him go so easily. They would hunt him to the ends of the galaxy, stop at nothing to silence him and recover their precious technology. And so Paul ran, always one step ahead, always looking over his shoulder. He became a legend among the stars, a phantom who could slip through the tightest nets and evade the most determined pursuers. But even as he fought against the Terran Alliance, Paul knew that his greatest challenge still lay ahead. He had to bring the alien races together, to forge a true alliance against the threat of human dominance. It was a daunting task, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But Paul knew he had no choice. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and he was the only one who could tip the scales. And so he pressed on, driven by a fierce determination and an unshakable belief in the power of freedom. He would fight for the Rizians, for the alien races, for every sentient being in the galaxy. He would fight for the future, even if it cost him everything. With each new ally Paul gained, his network grew stronger and more diverse. From the insectoid cliques, with their lightning-fast ships and unparalleled espionage skills, to the towering Vaughn, whose mastery of gravity manipulation technology made them invaluable in space combat, Paul built a coalition of races united in their opposition to the Terran Alliance's machinations. But even as his power grew, so did the dangers he faced. The Terran Alliance dispatched their most ruthless agents to track him down, while the remnants of the Rizian ruling class, desperate to reclaim their lost technology, sent assassins and saboteurs to undermine his efforts. Paul fought them all, his skills honed by a lifetime of combat, and his resolve fueled by the righteousness of his cause. He led daring raids on Terran Alliance outposts, stealing data and resources that he could use in his fight. He negotiated complex treaties and alliances, his charm and intelligence winning over even the most skeptical of alien leaders. And through it all he kept his ultimate goal in sight, a galaxy free from the tyranny of mind control, where every sentient being could live in peace and freedom. But Paul knew that he couldn't achieve his vision alone. He needed a symbol, a rallying point that could unite the disparate alien races and inspire them to stand together against the Terran Alliance. And so he planned a grand summit, a meeting of the greatest minds and most influential leaders from across the galaxy. It was a risky gambit, one that could easily backfire if the Terran Alliance caught wind of it. But Paul was willing to take that risk. He sent out coded messages and secret invitations, using every trick and contact he had accumulated over his long campaign. And finally, after months of preparation and anticipation, the day of the summit arrived. Paul stood on a rocky promontory overlooking the neutral ground he had chosen for the meeting, his heart pounding with excitement and trepidation. The alien representatives arrived in a steady stream, their ships landing in a riot of colors and shapes. Paul greeted each one personally, his smile warm and his handshake firm. But just as the last delegate took their seat, a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the meeting ground. Paul's heart stopped as he recognized the silhouette, the graceful curves and sharp angles that he knew as well as his own reflection. It was Rigel, alive and whole, her eyes glinting with a cold, hard light that he had never seen before. She strode forward, her movements fluid and purposeful, until she stood face to face with Paul. "Hello, Paul," she said, her voice a mocking purr. It's been a long time. Paul's mouth went dry, his mind reeling with shock and confusion. "Rigel," he croaked. "How? I thought you were—" "Dead?" she finished, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "No, Paul, I was never dead. It was all a ruse, a way to infiltrate your little rebellion and gather intelligence for the Terran Alliance." Paul staggered back, his world spinning. He had mourned Rigel, had carried the weight of her loss with him through every battle and every triumph. And now, to learn that it had all been a lie. But even as he reeled from the betrayal, Paul's mind was racing, putting together the pieces of the puzzle. Rigel's miraculous survival, her sudden appearance here, at the summit he had worked so hard to organize. "Are you here to stop me?" he said, his voice hardening with anger and determination. "To sabotage the summit and keep the alien races divided?" Rigel laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Oh, Paul," she said, shaking her head. "You always were too clever for your own good. But you're right. I can't let you go through with this little scheme of yours. The Terran Alliance has plans for this galaxy, and we won't let a traitor like you stand in our way." Around them, the alien representatives murmured in confusion and alarm, their eyes darting between Paul and Rigel. Paul could feel their trust in him wavering, their resolve crumbling in the face of this shocking revelation. He had to act fast, had to find a way to salvage the situation before it all fell apart. But as he looked into Rigel's eyes, cold and hard as diamonds, he knew that there would be no easy resolution. This was a betrayal that cut deeper than any wound, a rift that could never be healed, and as Paul squared his shoulders and faced his former friend, he knew that the battle for the galaxy's future had only just begun. "Why, Rigel?" Paul asked, his voice raw with emotion. "Why would you betray everything we fought for, everything we believed in?" Rigel's smile was sharp and cutting. "You still don't get it, do you, Paul? I never believed in your little crusade. I was always loyal to the Terran Alliance, to the dream of human supremacy." She circled him, her steps measured and predatory. "You think you're fighting for freedom, for the rights of every sentient being in the galaxy. But you're wrong. The strong rule the weak, Paul. That's the way it's always been, and the way it always will be." Paul shook his head, his fists clenching at his sides. "No," he said, his voice low and fierce. "I won't accept that. I won't let you twist the truth to justify your own greed and cruelty." And with a roar of fury, he launched himself at Rigel, his fists flying in a blur of motion. She met him head-on, her own body a whirlwind of deadly grace. They fought like demons, their blows fueled by years of pent-up anger and betrayal. Around them the alien representatives scattered, some fleeing in terror, others watching in stunned fascination. But Paul and Rigel were oblivious to the chaos they had unleashed. They were locked in a battle that was as much ideological as it was physical, each blow a testament to the depth of their convictions. Paul fought with the strength of his beliefs, his every move a declaration of his commitment to freedom and justice. But Rigel was a formidable opponent, her skills honed by years of training, and her resolve fueled by a ruthless ambition. Back and forth they went, trading blows and taunts, their bodies battered and bleeding. But even as the fight dragged on, Paul could feel his strength waning, his injuries taking their toll. And then, in a moment of terrible clarity, he saw his opening. Rigel lunged forward, her guard dropping for just an instant, and in that instant, Paul struck. His fist connected with her jaw, the impact sending her staggering backwards. She fell to the ground, her eyes wide with shock and pain. Paul stood over her, his chest heaving with exertion. "It's over, Rigel," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion and sorrow. "You've lost." But even as he spoke the words, he knew that the victory was a hollow one. The summit was in ruins, the alien representatives scattered to the winds, and the Terran Alliance's treachery had been laid bare for all to see. Paul looked out over the wreckage of his dreams, his heart heavy with the weight of all that had been lost. But even in that moment of despair, he felt a flicker of hope. The alien races had seen the truth, had witnessed the depths of the Terran Alliance's betrayal, and in that shared knowledge Paul saw the seeds of a new alliance, a new hope for the future. He turned to the representatives who had stayed to witness the end of the fight, his eyes burning with a fierce determination. "The Terran Alliance has shown its true face today," he said, his voice ringing out across the rocky plain. "But we will not let their lies and their cruelty define our future. We will stand together as one galaxy, and we will fight for our freedom." There was a moment of silence, a held breath that seemed to stretch out into eternity. And then, one by one, the alien representatives stepped forward, their faces set with a grim resolve. They clasped Paul's hand, their grips firm and unyielding. And in that moment, Paul knew that the fight was far from over. The Terran Alliance would not give up its power easily, and there would be many more battles to come. But he also knew that he would not have to face those battles alone. He had allies now, friends and comrades who would stand with him to the bitter end. And as he looked up at the stars, blazing bright in the inky void of space, Paul felt a sense of purpose settle over him like a mantle. He had been chosen for this fight, had been given the strength and the will to see it through. And he would not rest until the galaxy was free, until every sentient being could live in peace and dignity. No matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice, Paul would fight for that future. And in the end he knew that he would prevail, for he was a warrior of the stars, a champion of the oppressed and the downtrodden. He was Paul Brown, and he would never stop fighting for what was right. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.